At the second public Moscow trial in January 1937, Karl Radek and Yuri Pyatakov, two of Trotsky's followers, testified that Leon Trotsky was collaborating with Nazi Germany and fascist Japan to overthrow the Soviet government led by Joseph Stalin. Grigory Sokolnikov, an oppositionist but not a Trotskyist, also testified to Trotsky's collaboration with Japan. At the third public Moscow trial of March 1938, Christian Rakovsky, one of Trotsky's closest associates for many years, testified that he himself had direct knowledge of Trotsky's collaboration with the Japanese government. Trotsky himself denied these charges. This meant nothing, since anyone charged with such activities would deny them, whether he were guilty or innocent. The charges against Trotsky were never widely believed beyond the communist movement. On February 25, 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered his famous secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev hinted that at least some of the defendants in these trials were punished unjustly. Thereafter, some of the defendants were rehabilitated in the Soviet Union and declared to have been innocent. By the late 1980s, almost all the defendants at all the Moscow trials, plus the defendants in the Tukhachevsky affair military trial of May and June 1937, as well as a great many others, have been declared to have been innocent of all charges. There is a consensus among historians and Trotskyists that the Moscow trials were fabrications, the defendants all innocent victims of frame-up, and all the conspiracies, inventions of either the NKVD, that's the political police, or of Stalin himself. This consensus is a constituent part of the model or paradigm of Soviet history that is dominant within Russia itself and beyond its borders, and which I have called the anti-Stalin paradigm. However, no evidence that the trials were fabricated and the confessions faked has ever been published. In the first 12 chapters of my book, Trotsky's Amalgams, I provide ample evidence that the accusations and confessions at these trials were indeed genuine. During the past decade, a lot of documentary evidence has emerged from the former Soviet archives. I have written a number of works, including a number of chapters in the present book and in Volume 1, Trotsky's Amalgams, in which I point out that we now have strong evidence that the confessions were not false and that the Moscow trials defendants appear to have been truthful in confessing to conspiracies against the Soviet government. That work has led me to the present question. I set out to see whether I could find still more evidence that Trotsky had collaborated with the Germans and Japanese. The present volume is the result. Of course, in the case of human history, and even of science, there arises the possibility of fabrication or faked evidence. In my book, I devote a lot of attention to this problem. In the second half of this talk, I will briefly summarize some of the evidence that Trotsky did collaborate with the Nazis and Japanese. First, though, some discussion of methodology is in order. And I'm going to set my cell phone here to airplane mode so that I don't get disturbed, all right? Because that wouldn't be good. Okay. Now it should be okay. Yeah, maybe that would be a good idea for other people to do as well. Airplane mode is very helpful. Okay. Some discussion of methodology is in order. Objectivity and persuasion. Political prejudice dominates in the study of Soviet history, particularly since opposition to what I call the anti-Stalin paradigm incurs risks to one's job security, possibility of promotion, and publication opportunities, among other possible dangers. Conclusions that contradict the dominant model of Soviet history, that's the anti-Stalin paradigm, are routinely dismissed as being the result of bias or incompetence. Conclusions that cast doubt upon accusations against Stalin, or whose implications tend to make him look either good or simply less evil than the predominant paradigm holds him to have been, are called Stalinist. Any objective study of the evidence now available, objective study, is bound to be called Stalinist simply because it reaches conclusions that are politically unacceptable to those who have a strong political bias, be it anti-communist generally or Trotskyist specifically. The aim of my present book is to examine, in the light of the evidence now available, the allegations that Leon Trotsky collaborated with Germany and Japan against the Soviet Union. This study is not an attempt to prove Trotsky guilty of conspiring with the Germans and Japanese, nor is it an attempt to defend Trotsky against such charges. I have tried hard to do what an investigator does in the case of a crime in which he has no bias, no parti pris, but only wishes to solve the crime. I do wish to persuade the fair-minded, objective reader that I have carried out a competent, honest investigation, namely that I have done the following. Collected all the evidence I could find supporting the contention that Trotsky collaborated with the Germany and Japan. Collected all the negative evidence, any alibi Trotsky or his son and chief political aide Leon Sedov may have had. Studied all this evidence carefully and honestly, and drawn my conclusions logically on the basis of that evidence. I wish to persuade the objective reader that I have reached my conclusion on the basis of evidence and its analysis, and not on any other basis, such as that of political bias. I am not out to arraign or convict Trotsky. I remain ready to be convinced that Trotsky did not collaborate with Germany and Japan if in the future evidence that those charges are false should come to light. Throughout this book, I have tried to anticipate the objections of a skeptical critic. This is no more than any careful, objective researcher should do. In the first chapter, I have a lengthy discussion of the question of evidence. In this and the following chapters, I follow each presentation of evidence with a critical examination. In the final chapter of this section, the reader will find a review and refutation of the objections that a sharp but fair-minded critic might have. I am aware that there is a subset of readers for whom evidence is irrelevant, for whom this is not a matter of evidence, but rather one of belief or loyalty. I discuss the arguments normally raised from this quarter in a subsection entitled Objectivity and Denial. In any historical inquiry, as in any criminal case, belief and loyalty are irrelevant to the truth or falsehood of the hypothesis. A belief that is not rationally founded on evidence cannot be dispelled by a sound argument and by evidence. Identifying, locating, gathering, and even studying and interpreting evidence are skills that can be taught to anyone. The most difficult, and unfortunately all too rare skill in historical research is the discipline of objectivity. In order to reach true conclusions, that is, statements that are more truthful than other possible statements about a given matter, a researcher must first question and subject to doubt any preconceived ideas she may hold about the subject under investigation. It is one's own preconceived ideas and prejudices that are most likely to sway one into a subjective interpretation of the evidence. Therefore, the researcher must take special steps to make certain this does not happen. This can be done. The techniques are known and widely practiced in the physical and social sciences. They can be adapted to historical research as well. If such techniques are not practiced, the historian will inevitably be seriously swayed from an objective understanding of the evidence by her own pre-existing preferences and biases. This is called confirmation bias. That will all but guarantee that the historian's conclusions are false, even if she is in possession of the best evidence and all the skills necessary to analyze it. Nowhere is a devotion to objectivity more essential or less practiced than in the field of Soviet history of the Stalin period. Because without a dedication to objectivity, it is impossible to discover the truth. This study strives to be objective. Its conclusions will displease and even outrage a good many persons who are dedicated not to objectivity and the truth, but to protecting the legend of Trotsky as an honorable revolutionary, or to defending the Cold War anti-communist paradigm of Soviet history. What do you mean, evidence? What kind of evidence should we accept as valid? Unless objective criteria are established and then rigorously adhered to, the researcher will almost certainly find, in scare quotes, what his historical preconceptions, his favorite paradigm, tells him to look for. In doing so, he will either ignore or misconstrue anything that does not fit his preconceived ideas. What a researcher agrees to accept as evidence and to exclude as evidence is too often a reflection of his historical paradigm. The problem of acceptable evidence is simply magnified in the case of a charge of a secret conspiracy, as here. There are serious problems with any kind of evidence. 1. Confessions in or out of court. They might be fabricated for any one of a number of motives, including currying favor with the prosecution or state, as evidence that one has repented, to shift the blame onto someone else, as a result of torture or the threat of torture, threats against one's family, and so on. 2. Incrimination by associates. These are open to the same kinds of tampering as are confessions by the accused. Documentary evidence. Documents can be forged. Any modern state has the technical means to fabricate documents that will convince anyone, except possibly an independent scientific expert who is allowed to use destructive methods of analysis to test the chemical composition of the ink, molecular analysis of the paper, and so forth, in order to determine whether the document is genuine. As this is virtually never permitted in the case of archival documents deemed to be important, skillful forgery remains a powerful tool of historical falsification. Documentary evidence can also be destroyed. Russian researchers have told us that Khrushchev had a great many papers, perhaps amounting to thousands of pages, removed from archives during his leadership in the Soviet Union. Some documents also have been removed from the closed Trotsky archive at Harvard University. No archive is or can be completely secure from such manipulation. Moreover, how likely is it that agreements of espionage and conspiracy would have been written down in the first place? Anything written down at some point would surely have been hidden securely, or more likely destroyed as soon as read. As long as such written evidence remained, it would pose a terrible threat to any conspirator. We can be certain of the existence of one such conspiracy in Soviet history. That among members of the Presidium to get rid of Lavrentiy Beria, because it succeeded on June 26, 1953. Yet, no prior written record of that conspiracy has ever come to light, and no single canonical account of it exists even today. In general, then, there is no kind of evidence that cannot be forged or faked. Neither is there any kind of evidence that can by itself provide conclusive proof of any act. In June 1937, in Moscow, at the address of the Central Executive Committee, which was then formally the highest organ of state power in the Soviet Union, a telegram arrived from Leon Trotsky in Mexico. This telegram ended up not in the Central Executive Committee, but in the NKVD, political police, where it was directed to Stalin. Stalin wrote on it the following remark, quote, "Ugly spy, brazen spy of Hitler," end quote. Stalin not only signed his name under this, but gave it to Molotov, Voroshilov, Mikoyan, and Zhdanov to sign, and these were all people in the Politburo of the Soviet leadership at that time. If the words on this telegram were the only evidence we had that led us to suspect the accusations against Trotsky were not fabricated, not by Stalin, or to his knowledge at least, they would still be highly significant. Stalin, after all, saw all investigative materials, including huge quantities of evidence that is either still classified in Russia today or has been destroyed. Why is there no German or Japanese evidence of Trotsky's collaboration? I believe that the single most likely reason for the absence of such evidence is simply that no one should expect a conspiracy like this to be documented anywhere, ever, much less in archives. The demands of secrecy and security require that such information be exchanged only by word of mouth. I have already cited the lack of archival or in fact of any documentary evidence of the successful conspiracy against Lavrenti Beria in 1953. This conspiracy must have involved at least half a dozen men. Accounts of it by its participants do not agree in details, except that it was all planned and carried out through oral communication only. Now, examples of some of the evidence. The Moscow trials. We now have some additional interrogations and confessions from the former NKVD archive in Moscow that corroborate the testimony in the first Moscow trial. We have two interrogations of Pavel Olberg and Betty Olberg, brother and wife respectively of Valentin Olberg, a defendant who testified that he had been sent by Trotskyists, including by Trotsky's son Leon Sedov, to assassinate Stalin. Olberg claimed there was a systematic collaboration between the Gestapo, that's the German political police, and German Trotskyists with Trotsky's consent. We now have pretrial testimony, both from defendants and from others, that confirmed that Trotskyists were working together with German spies and Russian fascists to sabotage Soviet mining operations and kill miners. This testimony also confirms Yuri Pyatakov's testimony during the second Moscow trial that he had made special arrangements with German companies in order to fund Trotsky's activities by sending money to Leon Sedov. In 1989, a short segment from Grigory Sokolnikov's pretrial testimony was published. He was a defendant in the second Moscow trial in January 1937. In it, Sokolnikov testified that the Japanese ambassador had told him that Trotsky, quote, had made certain proposals to my government, the Japanese government. This is confirmed by a newly published document by Yuri Pyatakov. In his statement to Nikolai Yezhov, at the time the head of the NKVD, of December 19th and 20th, 1936, a statement which was not published until 2015, Pyatakov mentions Japanese Ambassador Ota's contact with Sokolnikov. Here's a quote. Also, Sokolnikov told me that he had had a talk with the Japanese, with Ota, I think, from which it was also clear that Trotsky was carrying on negotiations with representatives of the Japanese government. Pyatakov makes this remark in passing, without any emphasis. Sokolnikov must have told him about this incident. It confirms Sokolnikov's claim that Trotsky had been conspiring with the Japanese. At the same second Moscow trial of January 1937, Karl Radek testified that Trotsky had informed Pyatakov in December 1935 that he had concluded an agreement, Trotsky had concluded an agreement, with Rudolf Hess, deputy leader of the Nazi Party, right, the guy just below Hitler. But in a passage that was not included in the transcript of the trial, Radek also said there was an agreement, and I quote, in time of war, to develop extensive, diversive activities in enterprises of the war industry and at the front. These diversive activities are to be carried on under Trotsky's orders, agreed upon with the German General Staff. Now, Yakovlev's confession of October 1937. Among the documents from former Soviet archives that had been published since the end of the Soviet Union, one of the most significant for our purposes is the lengthy interrogation of Yakovlev. Yakovlev was one of the very highest members of the Soviet government and Bolshevik Party outside the ranks of the Politburo itself. Yakovlev was arrested on October the 12th, 1937. On October 15th to October 18th, Yakovlev confessed that in 1923, Trotsky had asked him to be a Trotskyist sleeper in the party, to go underground, cease all contact with any Trotskyists, and climb into responsible party positions. A few pages further in his interrogation, Yakovlev outlines how in 1935 in Berlin he was recruited by German intelligence. The German agent who, according to Yakovlev, recruited him into cooperation did so on two bases. First, the Germans knew from Russian émigrés in Germany that Yakovlev had collaborated with the Russian Tsarist Okranka, or secret police, toward the end of 1916 in Petrograd. The German agent cited this information to blackmail Yakovlev by threatening to expose it. The German agent also knew from Trotsky about Yakovlev's participation in the Trotskyist underground and revealed this to him. In my book, that's the one I'm talking about today, that book, I quote at length from this document, which includes details of Trotsky's collaboration with Germany. Yakovlev confirms that as early as 1923, Trotsky formed a factional underground movement within the party. The years 1922 and 1923 pop up frequently in the transcript of the March 1938 Moscow trial as the year that many of those who confessed to being in the Trotskyist underground began their activities. Yakovlev admits direct ties with German intelligence. This confirms allegations by others that Trotsky's movement had such contacts. Yakovlev also confirms German ties, the German ties of General Jan Gamarnik, one of the military conspirators led by Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, and by Joseph Varekis, head of the party in the Far East, arrested for ties with the Japanese. In private conversations with his Japanese handlers, NKVD General Genrikh Lyushkov, who defected to the Japanese in June 1938, identified both Gamarnik and Varekis as genuine conspirators in the Far East. That is, Yakovlev claimed that he heard directly from a German agent that Trotsky was working with the Germans. He confirms that he also heard this from Pyatakov, and that he had also received this information in writing from Trotsky himself. Stalin's handwritten comments on this confession, this is Yakovlev's confession, show that he believed this confession of Yakovlev was true, and Stalin suggested further lines of investigation following from it. No reasonable reading of this evidence would suggest that Stalin had Yakovlev framed and then carried on a charade by annotating the confession and asking for Yakovlev's wife, also a party member, to be brought in for questioning about his activities. Yakovlev's confession is not mentioned at all by Stephen Kotkin in his recent book, Stalin, Volume 2, though Kotkin cites many other documents published in the same volume. Yakovlev's confession is clearly incompatible with Stalin's anti-Stalin paradigm. Marshal Budyani's letter to Voroshilov. Okay. One of the judges at the Special Military Court that tried and convicted Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky and 7 other high-ranking military leaders was Marshal Semyon Budyani. On June 26, 1937, Budyani sent a letter to Commissar for Defense, Clement Voroshilov, in which he outlined his impression of the trial and what it meant. This letter has always been dishonestly quoted out of context. For example, among the lines that have been quoted by other scholars is this sentence. Primakov, another of the defendants, very stubbornly denied that he led a terrorist group consisting of Schmidt, Kuzmichev, and others against Comrade Voroshilov. That's been quoted. What has always been omitted is the sentences which follow immediately after those sentences. And here they are. Okay, testimony by Primakov. by Budyani. This is Budyani quoting the testimony at the trial. Quote, Primakov denied this on the basis that, he said, Trotsky had entrusted him, Primakov, with a more serious task, to organize an armed uprising in Leningrad, for which purpose he, Primakov, was obliged to remain strictly secret from all terrorist groups, to break his ties with all Trotskyists and rightists, and at the same time to win for himself authority and the absolute trust of the party and the army command. Marshal Tukhachevsky's confessions. We have fragments of confessions by other military conspirators who speak about Trotsky's ties to Germany. But in the case of Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky himself, we have more lengthy passages. In them, the Marshal outlines details of his collaboration both with Trotsky and with the German General Staff to assure the defeat of the Red Army when attacked by the German Army. In my book, I give lengthy quotations from these materials. Tukhachevsky claimed that he also received direct written instructions through General Vitov Putna from Leon Trotsky, who was transmitting instructions from his father, Leon Sedov, who was transmitting instructions from his father, Trotsky. Putna assured Tukhachevsky that Trotsky had established direct ties to the German government and general staff. More evidence. The Schwernik Report for Khrushchev, 1963 to 1964. During the 22nd Party Congress of October 1961, Nikita Khrushchev and his supporters in the Soviet leadership leveled an even stronger attack against Stalin than Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech had been. After the Congress, Stalin's body was removed from Lenin's tomb, and a new wave of materials attacking Stalin and those closely associated with him was published. This anti-Stalin campaign, for so it may be called, ended shortly after Khrushchev was removed from office at the Central Committee meeting of October 1964 by Leonid Brezhnev and others. In early 1962, the Presidium of the Communist Party, formerly the Politburo, and in effect Khrushchev himself, authorized a Blue Ribbon Commission to investigate the Moscow trials and the executions of the 1930s, and especially the so-called Tukhachevsky affair. This commission seems to have had total access to all the investigative and other materials concerning the repressions of the 1930s. Its purpose seems to have been to find further evidence, further information for attacks on Stalin and his supporters, and justificatory materials for further rehabilitations. In fact, it ended up providing further evidence that the accused were guilty. Roman Rudenko's report to Molotov of June 10, 1956. This report has not been published, but a part of it was obtained by my Moscow colleague Vladimir Bobrov from the former NKVD archive. There is much information of interest to us here. Here is one such passage. All right, this is Roman Rudenko in 1956 was the chief Soviet prosecutor. Quote, at his interrogation of June 2, 1937, Putna had already confessed that in the spring of 1931 he had established espionage ties with the German general staff, and at various times given the Germans, through their generals, and he names a bunch of generals, information about the military staff of the Red Army, its organizational structure and location of its forces, about armaments, the system of military readiness. Putna declared, moreover, that in 1936, at the time of his and Tukhachevsky's trips together to England, Tukhachevsky compared the relationship of forces and proved to him that the defeat of the Soviet Union in a war with Germany was inevitable, and that he, Putna, agreed with Tukhachevsky and said to him that for the swiftest defeat of Soviet forces, it was essential to act together on the side of the Trotskyist organization. However, Putna did not confess how Tukhachevsky reacted to this. Feldman, another of the defendants in the military trial, the Tukhachevsky trial, also confessed that from Tukhachevsky's words, he, Feldman, was aware that he, Tukhachevsky, had an agreement with Pyatakov concerning a disruption in supply of artillery, and also maintained a connection with Trotsky, from whom he was receiving directives concerning counter-revolutionary activity. End quote. Rudenko summarized details from some of the interrogations of military conspirators, Putna, Tukhachevsky, and Yona Yakir, that have not been made public. These passages tie Trotsky to collaboration with Germany in several ways. 1. Putna, the leading Trotskyist among the military men, claimed that he had been in touch with Trotsky, was involved in a Trotskyist military organization, and was conspiring with the German general staff. 2. Tukhachevsky confirmed that Primakov and Putna were in touch with Trotsky, as he himself was, and that he and the Trotskyist cadres were working together. 3. According to Yakir, another of the military conspirators, Tukhachevsky had said that the military conspiracy was being organized in coordination with Trotsky and, quote, according to his directive, end quote. 4. Yakir confirmed that the military conspirators were to work for the defeat of the Red Army in a war with Germany and Poland. 5. Yakir said that Trotsky had direct ties with the German general staff. The richness and consistency of this material suggests that there is yet more evidence of Trotsky's contact with Nazi Germany in the investigative materials of the Tukhachevsky group. Genrikh Yagoda's confessions. There exists a good deal more such second-hand evidence of Trotsky's collaboration with the Germans and Japanese in recently published Soviet archival materials. Ginrich S. Yagoda was commissar of the NKVD. NKVD means Ministry of Internal Affairs, which included the political police, from 1934 until he was dismissed in September 1936. He was arrested in early March 1937. Subsequently, he was one of the leading defendants in the Third Moscow Trial of March 1938. That's often known as the Bukharin Trial or the Bukharin-Rykov Trial. In 1997, a number of materials from Ginrich Yagoda's investigative file were published in a very small edition of 200 copies in the provincial city of Kazan in Russia by some researchers employed by the FSB, which is the successor to the KGB. Evidently, they were working on their doctoral degrees in history. Since that time, some of the documents published in this collection have been published elsewhere, evidently from copies held in other archives. In these interrogation transcripts, Yagoda makes startling confessions. These confessions include details of his own collaboration with German intelligence. Rakovsky's confession at trial and unpublished. On February 27th, on February 27th, 1937, after the January 1937 Second Moscow Trial, during which Christian Rakovsky had been named as a conspirator, Trotsky wrote, okay, he's in Mexico now, "It is quite certain that in the next trial, with Rakovsky participating as the accused, there will be charges of conspiratorial dealings between Rakovsky and the Japanese diplomats and military," under orders from Trotsky, of course. End quote. On April 15th, 1937, and it was a little bit less than 2 months later, Trotsky mentioned Rakovsky again. Quote, "At that time, I was of the opinion that Rakovsky was sent for demonstrative purposes to Japan, in order to show the whole world that he was free. His repentance was sincere. Now I ask myself if it did not have a second purpose, to frame him afterwards, that he was connected with the Japanese military chiefs in the government." Rakovsky was one of the defendants in the Third Moscow Trial of March 2nd to 15, 1938. As we shall see, Rakovsky did indeed claim exactly what Trotsky, quote, predicted, that he had been approached by, quote, Japanese military chiefs in the government, under orders from Trotsky. On July 7th, 1956, Ivan Serov, Khrushchev's head of the KGB, formerly the NKVD, made a report to the Molotov Commission, which had been set up by Khrushchev to exonerate or declare innocent the Moscow trial's defendants. In my book, I devote many pages to analyzing Serov's report, the whole last chapter, in fact, comparing its contents with what we know now from former Soviet archives and other primary sources. I show in great detail that Serov was lying to the Molotov Commission, no doubt in service to Khrushchev's plan to convince the commission members that Stalin had framed all these men. In this report, Serov has a lot to say about Rakovsky. He claims that Rakovsky was innocent, was forced to admit his guilt, and had told several people after the trial that the trial was a fraud and a frame-up. In my book, I prove that Serov was lying. But there was one person who did confirm Rakovsky's spying for Japan, and that was Leon Trotsky himself. On February 27, 1937, just 1 month after Rakovsky's arrest, months before Rakovsky confessed to spying for Japan, Trotsky had predicted that Rakovsky would do precisely that. We recall that on February 27, 1937, Trotsky wrote, quote, "It is quite certain that in the next trial with Rakovsky participating as the accused, there will be charges of conspiratorial dealings with Rakovsky and the Japanese diplomats and military under orders from Trotsky." And again on April 15, 1937, Trotsky wrote, "Now I ask myself if it did not have a second purpose, to frame him afterwards that he was connected with the Japanese military chiefs in the government." Trotsky predicted that Rakovsky would confess not to contact with agents of Japanese intelligence, but to direct contact with persons of the highest rank, with diplomats and, quote, Japanese military chiefs in the government. And sure enough, Rakovsky said that he met with Koki Hirota and Keisuke Okada. Hirota was Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs. Okada was Prime Minister of Japan and also an admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy. These men perfectly fit Trotsky's description of Japanese diplomats and military, Japanese military chiefs in the government, right? Because Okada was not only Prime Minister, but also an admiral in the Navy. He was a military chief in the government. Trotsky did not write, Rakovsky may be charged with collaboration with the Japanese under orders from Trotsky. Trotsky did not write, perhaps this time a defendant will be forced to admit contact with high-ranking person under orders from Trotsky. Trotsky wrote that it is quite certain that between Rakovsky and the Japanese military, diplomats and military. 6 weeks later, Trotsky was even more precise, with the Japanese military chiefs in the government. How could Trotsky have been both so precise and so certain about whom Rakovsky would admit to meeting with, and at the same time have been so completely accurate? There is only one hypothesis that offers an answer to these questions, and that is consistent with Trotsky's stated practice to expose the scheme in advance. Trotsky several times said he would do this. Trotsky had to have known that Rakovsky did these things. Moreover, we also know how Trotsky knew Rakovsky would testify. Rakovsky himself had informed him. In his trial testimony, this is the third Moscow trial in 1938, Rakovsky stated, I wrote to Trotsky about all this, about my negotiations in Tokyo, about my conversations with Uraniev, about my meetings, and of course, about this last proposition. How did Rakovsky manage to write Trotsky from within the Soviet Union? According to the testimony of two defendants, Rakovsky had a way of contacting Trotsky that was special to himself. According to Yezhov's letter to Stalin of January 27, 1937, Pyatakov had testified. Concerning Rakovsky, Trotsky said that it was essential to talk with him and give him a push in his work along the lines of the Trotskyist organization. From this I deduced that Rakovsky had some personal line of contact with Trotsky. Conclusion. What is the significance of this result? Leon Trotsky did indeed collaborate with the Nazis and Japanese. This is the only reasonable conclusion that can be drawn from the evidence. My examination of it shows that it cannot have been faked, forged, say, by Stalin or by the NKVD. The implication for our understanding of Soviet history, and indeed of world history, are vast. Briefly, here are just a few of these implications. 1. This result provides further evidence that the Moscow trials were honest trials, and that the defendants testified as they chose to testify, and that those who were adjudged to be guilty really were guilty. 2. This means there was no terror. As I show in my book, Yezhov versus Stalin, the whole concept of the Stalinist terror is bogus, an invention of Trotsky, Khrushchev, and anti-communist Western pseudo-scholars like Robert Conquest. 3. The conspiracies of the Reichs, Trotskyists, Zinovievites, military leaders, and fascists that were uncovered in the Moscow trials, including Trotsky's collaboration with Nazi Germany and fascist Japan, if they had been successful, planned to ally with the Nazis and Japanese against the rest of Europe. With the vast material and human resources of the Soviet Union, Hitler and the Japanese would have been far more powerful. Hitler could have invaded England, as he planned to do. In the Pacific, Japan would have been a far stronger enemy against the United States. Europe would have gone fascist much more rapidly and for a much longer time. World politics would have taken a much more right-wing, pro-fascist, anti-working class trajectory. And 4, and this means that Stalin, the same Stalin who is so viciously lied about and attacked by virtually all official certified Soviet experts, Stephen Kotkin, and in all the world's mass media, Stalin and the Soviet working class saved the world from Nazism and fascism not just once in 1941 to 43 by defeating Hitler's Wehrmacht, but twice. The first time by uncovering and defeating the conspiracies that would have made the Soviet Union into a fascist ally. I also want to spell out some of the implication of my research for the mainstream version of Soviet history of the Stalin period. All the stories of purported crimes of Stalin and crimes of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period are deliberate lies. This is my 6th book in English. I have 3 more books that are not in English, in which I investigate a great many allegations of crimes supposedly committed by Stalin or the Soviet Union during his time. To date, I have not yet found a single actual crime by Stalin or the Soviet Union. Not one. There seems to have been an escalation of anti-Stalin pseudo-scholarly books in recent years. The fall of 2017 saw the publication of Anne Applebaum's book Red Famine, which falsely blamed Stalin for the 1932-33 famine in the Ukraine and adjacent parts of Russia and Kazakhstan. A few weeks later, Volume 2 of Princeton professor Stephen Kotkin's biography of Stalin was published. I have now completed my study of Kotkin's book, which is more than 1,100 pages long. It is an outrageously fraudulent work, full of provable lies. Later this year, I plan to write a short book exposing it. Meanwhile, I heartily recommend to you our own Raj Sakai's takedown of Kotkin, which he gave here as an address and was published recently online in several places. In May or June of this year, 2018, I will publish a book-length study of the so-called Katyn Massacre. This is the shooting of between 15 and 22,000 Polish prisoners of war. The anti-communist, pro-fascist Polish government allied itself with the German Nazis to blame the Soviet Union for these executions. In 1989 to 1992, Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin stated that, indeed, the Soviet Union and Stalin had ordered these executions. This is false. In plain language, yet another anti-communist lie. My study of the primary source evidence demonstrates how shallow a fraud this story is. And to be honest, I was entirely prepared to discover that the Soviets had shot these Polish prisoners. Instead, I found the opposite. I hope to speak to you about this book in July. Hopefully I'll be back then. I can't think of any other historical period.
Can you stop here for a second?